Okay, we are now live on YouTube.
Well, good.
Yeah, so David, it's in your hands.
Shall we give it another couple of minutes?
Give it another couple of minutes.
People are still coming in.
Oh.
I don't want the Goldsteins to miss it.
Yeah, they're here. I've seen them.
Are they?
Yeah,
Oh.
they're here. Looking very tanned and very well.
Oh, there they are. Hi, Goldsteins. It's actually hotter here than it is there, so don't worry.
David, we're live.
Okay,
everybody appears to be in. If you'd like to take it away.
Okay, all right, we'll start. Good evening, everyone. Tonight we have a delightful author, Amanda Weinberg, who is a specialist and loves Italy, a specialist of Italy, really. Amanda will be talking about her inspiration for her novel, The Tears of Monterini. In 1998, she discovered the magical village of Piazza and became fascinated with its Jewish history and culture. She became closely connected to the village and its inhabitants and was inspired to write a novel based on the events during the fascist era of Mussolini. Tears of Monterini is her first novel. It's a historical piece of 100,000 words with commercial flavour. She has a deep connection with the village where the novel is set and have thread the characters she invented, their romance, their fears and longings through real life situations and events. Villa Sofia and saving the Jewish orphans is one just example of historical fact that she has interwoven into the story. I don't want to go into too much because it's very good. So Amanda will be speaking and will answer questions at the end. To ask questions, please either write in the chat rooms or in the remote hand, but don't start jumping up and down with waving because we don't always see you. So over to you, Amanda.
So good evening, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me, David. I'm here to speak about my book, The Tears of Monterini, my novel, which came out last year in August. And this novel has had quite a long trajectory. I discovered the village that inspired me in 1998, as David said. And from then on, I became very closely connected with it. And the idea of writing, I've always wanted to write. I've always wanted to write a novel. I wrote short stories. I used to write as a child. And then I found this village, and I'll explain how very soon when I share my screen. But I found this village, and then an idea of a novel started to germinate. And I discovered that this was a very special place with a story to tell. So in order to tell you about the inspiration for this novel, let me take you back to 1998. So I was working in my own company, doing a lot of traveling, and during the summer holidays, all I wanted to do was to go to France. So I used to go to France with my husband and my children, and we used to sit there. I speak French, I studied French, we used to be in France for the summer. And then one year, 1998, we just thought, for a change, let's go to Italy. Now, I had an Italian neighbor at the time called Anna, who wasn't Jewish. And I just said to her by chance, do you know anywhere that we could stay? Do you have any friends that might have an apartment that they could lend us? And she was from the north of Italy, near Milan. So you would think that she would find somewhere near Milan, but she didn't. She found a tiny village, which was a friend of a friend of a friend who had a place in this village that she had never heard of, I'd never heard of. And when I looked in the guidebooks said, avoid southern Tuscany. There's nothing to see, nothing to do. So we tried to find out more about the village. We went online, but this was in 1998. And you may remember it was very difficult at the beginning of the internet to get any information. And we would go on to our dial-up CompuServe, and there was nothing. There was nothing about this village. And all we knew was that the area called the Maremma had wild horses, and that was it. So we thought, right, we should go anyway. We've booked it, we're going. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because in a way it was Bashir to find this village. I mean, she was from the north. She could have found us any village in the north, anywhere to stay. But she discovered a friend who had a place in this tiny, incredible village, which we knew nothing about. So this is how our journey started. So I'm going to share the screen. And off we went through France and Switzerland, through central Italy, to this area here called the Maremma, which is part of Tuscany. It's in the southern tip of Tuscany. And the village we were going to is over here called Pitigliano. And it's right on the borders of Tuscany and Lazio and Umbria. And really, we knew nothing. We knew nothing about it. We didn't know what it looked like. We had no idea. And we had in the back of our minds the guidebook saying, avoid southern Tuscany. There's nothing to do. It's really boring. So when we actually turned the corner, the road verges to the left, and you turn the corner and there's this church at the corner, and suddenly this incredible view just pops out. This village pops out. It's built on a tuffo rock, a golden rock, and this incredible sight popped out, and I'll show you what we saw, which doesn't actually give it justice. But this was the sight we saw, and we stopped the car and we took photos, and we looked, I couldn't believe how incredible this was. And my daughter, who was about 8 at the time, took my hand and said, Mummy, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you tell us it was so lovely? And I just looked and I said, I really didn't know. And we had no idea. And the first sight of Pitigliano is actually incredibly magical, incredibly impressive. And friends who have been there, they see it and you just stand, you can't quite believe how stunningly beautiful it is. So this was our first introduction to somewhere that we knew very, very little about. Just get to the next. So, sorry, I think I've gone too far. So this is another view of the town. You can see there's a road there, and we started driving. This is the cathedral. It doesn't show the synagogue at this stage, but this is the cathedral, and the synagogue is actually just in front of the cathedral. So we started driving and along the road, and we passed what we discovered to be the Jewish cemetery, but we didn't know there was a gate, an iron gate, and later we discovered it was the Jewish cemetery. So we carried on our drive round, and you can see here, this is the road. And what I want to show you here, you can see all these are Etruscan ruins, which was quite important for me to discover the Etruscan part of this village. And I did include this is included very much in my book, as a way of remembering that this civilization was also extremely important to the village. So here's one more picture. And you can see in the village, I talk very much about the houses. I talk about the vineyards, the olive trees, and you can see that the setting really is the village of Pitigliano, although I did change the name, and I'll explain why a little bit later on. So we parked the car. And this is what we saw. We looked up, parked the car, and we saw a sign saying Synagogue. And we looked at each other and we thought, that's very odd that there's a synagogue here in this tiny village in the middle of the hills in southern Tuscany. Medieval village was unusual. And we thought, this is very interesting. So we started walking through the streets to try and find the lady. We had arranged to meet the lady who was renting us the apartment. So we were walking through the streets, and we saw in the shops kosher wine, and we looked at each other and we thought, that's very odd, kosher wine here in this medieval village. And they had white kosher wine and they had red kosher wine, and then we saw these packets of matzah that were tied up all ready to sell, as I suppose as a speciality for tourists. And we realized that we had arrived somewhere extremely special. And I think very, very quickly and very early on, the idea for a novel germinated in my mind. And I think it was the first year or the second year, we came back the following year and we bought somewhere there, and I became closely connected with the individuals. And the thing that really struck me about this place was that they loved the fact that we were Jewish. And that was very, very unusual. So I would walk around and people would rush up to me and grab my hand and say, you've bought somewhere here, that's incredible. And you're Jewish, that's so amazing. Your history is our history. And I felt quite uncomfortable because it wasn't really my history. I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. I'm not from Pitigliano, I'm not Italian, but they considered it very important that as a Jewish family, we had come back to that town. And right at the beginning, when we discovered this incredible Jewish history, all the streets, the food, the synagogue, we called Julian's father, who is a polymath and knows everything about anything Jewish. And he looked up in the Encyclopedia Judaica, and there was nothing about the village of Pitigliano, which was really interesting, because as soon as I discovered things and did my research, I learned quite quickly that in the 18th and 19th centuries, it had a huge density of Jews. There was a shul there was a yeshiva, there was a mikveh. It had an enormous, I think it was 20% of the village was Jewish in the 19th century. So that was really incredible to find out. And everywhere we went, people welcomed us for the fact that we were Jewish, which was very different from anywhere I'd been in Europe. And even, in the last few years of anti-Semitism that we've had in the UK, I always find it really refreshing to be there and to be welcomed so warmly by the fact that we were Jewish. So I'm going to move on to, this is the main street. So this is where we walked through the square, the Piazza, which does come into my book quite often. And we walked through and we discovered all the shops that I spoke about just now. So this is the area here of the Frata, where my two main characters, Jacopo Livi and Angela Gione, live. Jacopo is a Jewish, he's an intelligent, intellectual Jew who owns a bookshop, and his neighbor is a contadino, which is the word for a peasant farmer. And he's illiterate, very kind-hearted, and they live next to each other and have done for generations. And these two characters, I almost saw them sitting on the balcony, like you can see in the right picture, right-hand side. I saw them sitting there together, waiting for the birth of their children. It was almost like they appeared to me. And that was quite early on when we first arrived, the first or second year. And so these two characters came to represent the Jewish Catholic bond that I discovered in this really incredible place. And the Jewish Catholic bond was so strong. And what was so incredible was discovering that when Jews first arrived in the 16th century, they were welcomed. And I'll just tell you very quickly now, the reason they were welcomed was because in the 16th century, there were papal bulls but in the papal states. And these two papal bulls, which were in 1555 and 1569, the Jews were expelled from all of the papal states. So they had to go somewhere. And the Jews that were there were generally Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. And they spoke Ladino, and they were living in the papal states. They were expelled and they had to find somewhere to go. And Pitigliano had a count called Count Orsini, who was very fond of Jews for some reason. And he had a Jewish surgeon who he really liked. And so he welcomed them, and they came and they were allowed to work very freely. They were allowed to live wherever they liked. The ghetto didn't exist at that time. And because of the contadino, the peasant farming community, there was no competition. And so they settled side by side and lived very closely together and got on. And that carried on right the way through the generations, even to the fascist era, which I found really interesting. And of course, these two characters represent that Catholic Jewish bond that I saw over and over again. And I suppose the reason I wrote about the Mussolini, the fascist era, was because people were still alive that could talk about that era. And that was very interesting, talking to the individuals in the village that could tell me their stories. They could tell me what it was like living during Mussolini's fascist Italy. And it was very interesting for me because I've done, as probably lots of us have, we've done a lot of reading, we know a lot about the Holocaust in Germany and Austria and all other parts of Italy, of Europe, sorry. But in Italy, I knew a lot less. I knew about Primo Levi, and I knew that it was difficult for certain anti-fascist Jews, but I knew very little. And it was very, very interesting to start my research. So I did research the area. I did a lot of research. It took me years. And I got lots and lots of anecdotes and stories from all the individuals who lived there. And those stories I wove around my characters. So I put the stories in of a lot of coexistence that existed, that I put in to the individuals and the events that happened to them. And for the fascist era, I talked a lot to Elena Servi, who was the remaining Jewish woman in the village, and she told me of the stories and what happened to her and what happened to her family. And many of the Catholics that lived there told me how their individuals, their fathers, how they used to go with their fathers to save Jews during the fascist era. So that was all extremely interesting for me. And that became the focus point of my book. Although I did talk about the history and why Jews were there and why they came to Pitigliano in the format of a novel. In the 17th century, Count Medici arrived in Pitigliano. He took over from Count Orsini. He took over from the Orsini family, and he did not like the Jews. So he actually built the ghetto area, which you'll see in a moment. It's where the synagogue is. And Jews lived in the ghetto till the end of the 17th, till the end of the 18th century. They lived there, and he really didn't like them. So when he wanted them to go back inside those ghetto walls, he would get his soldiers to go along with their batons and knock on the doors and push them inside the ghetto walls. And these batons are really important, and I'll show you in another slide in a moment why they're so important. So this is the synagogue, and the synagogue, the original synagogue was built in 1598. And when you go inside the old synagogue and the museum, the new synagogue and the museum, you can see the remains underneath. But they're both quite old. The first one was 1598. It was rebuilt in 1835, and it collapsed in the 60s. Many Jews left. They were all saved during the fascist era, but many of them left afterwards because they wanted to be in larger communities like Florence or Rome. And nobody went to the synagogue, and it collapsed. And then in 1985, a huge refurbishment program took place to remember this incredible story and history and culture of the Jews of Pitigliano. And when we arrived, it opened in 1996. We arrived in 1998, and it was part of, they opened an association called La Piccola Gerusalemme, which is what the synagogue was called, Little Jerusalem. And it was called Little Jerusalem originally in the 16th century because there were many Jews there, and because the town looked like Jerusalem. It had this golden color. It was on this golden tufa rock, and it looked like Jerusalem, and it's got the name of La Piccola Gerusalemme, which is also the name of the association for the museum. There is only a museum now. The synagogue is there, and you can use it. People can come from Livorno or Rome for a mitzvah, for a wedding, but it is mainly a museum. But it's extremely beautiful. I show pictures inside. It's a typical Sephardi shul. You can see on the right, I talk a lot about the synagogue in my book. And you can see the awning, the wooden awning where the women sit behind. It's very tiny, the women's gallery there. But you can see it's very beautiful, and you can visit it. And then you can visit the whole museum, where you can see the mikvah, and you can see the cantina where they made wine, and where they used to bring the animals in for the slaughtering. It's a very interesting place. But there is one room that I love more than any other, and that's this room here. It's the Matzah oven room. And this was the room that was used by the women of Pitigliano during, just before Pesach, to make the panei azime, the matzah. And they would put the matzah on these long sticks and put them in the oven. It's a little bit like a pizza oven. And you would see them making them on these wooden blocks, stone blocks. And this is a really lovely, lovely room. And this has always been my favorite room. And I talk about it a lot in the book. My character, Bella, she goes there and she helps make matzah. She learns all about the matzah making process, and it very much defines the story as well. It's important within the story that I wrote, probably because I love it so much, this particular room. And here's a picture, gives you a bit of an idea of the women making the matzah. And the matzah is quite different from the Ashkenazi matzah that we have. It's round with lots and lots of holes, and you can buy it in Pitigliano now in all different kinds of flavors. Okay, so on the left, you have Elena Servi, and on the right is Roberta, who works in the shop attached to the synagogue, selling all the kosher and specialities of the village. Now, Elena Servi is in her 90s. She's the most unbelievable person, and she gave me a lot of information for my novel. and I heard and learnt what it was like living under fascist Italy. And this was very different from what I expected, because as a fascist country, you think, and the stories that you hear about Primo Levi and so on, you think it was really difficult for the Jews. However, it was much easier for the Jews under Mussolini until the Germans came. So the Jews under Mussolini had an easier time than the Jews in Yugoslavia or in Poland or in Austria or in Germany. And Mussolini kind of took a much more benevolent attitude towards them. He had a Jewish mistress called Margherita Zarfati, and there were so many Jews that were in the fascist party as well. And he just took a very much more benevolent attitude towards them than Hitler did, for example. And in fact, there was something I read about just recently about Goebbels, who said that, you know, it's time Mussolini starts to change his attitude towards the Jews. He's much too lenient. And he was more lenient, much more lenient, but he wasn't lenient towards the anti-fascists. So I think a lot of people think, oh, so many Jews were deported, but most of the Jews that were deported, certainly from the areas that I am talking about, those Jews that were deported there were deported because they were anti-fascist. So Primo Levi, you may know Carlo Levi, Leonie Ginsberg, these were all anti-fascist intellectuals. A lot of them were not particularly religious. They were Jewish by birth, but they didn't really keep anything, but they were very committed anti-fascists. And they had trouble because of their political views, not because of their religious views. And Primo Levi, in his autobiography, he says, if we get caught, we have to say, sono ebreo, I am Jewish, sono ebreo. As soon as you're sent over the border, you no longer say that you're Jewish. You have to say, sono antifascista, I'm an anti-fascist, because the Germans were much more lenient to the partisans and the anti-fascists than the Italians were. So it was much more of a political thing with Mussolini rather than a religious. He was not so anti the Jews, and you can see that all the way along in all the things that I discovered, how they allowed certain things that, you know, you just would never ever have seen in Nazi Germany. The Jewish star, they didn't wear the Jewish star. And it was very interesting because in this particular area of Italy, in Tuscany, Emilia-Romagna, Liguria, they were looked after. There were the anti-fascist rulings that came in 1938. So most Jews that worked in the state had to leave their jobs, but they were all protected by those who didn't have to leave their jobs. So if you had your own private practice or your own shop, you didn't have to leave it. Now, that was very different from other parts of Europe at the time. And my character, Jacopo, he has his bookshop, so he's able to carry on, and he can carry on working, and he can support those that can't. And from a lot of the people that I spoke to, both in this village and outside, said there was something almost gave them a sense of pride that even though they lost their jobs and the children didn't go to school, they formed schools, Jewish schools, and so many of them were intelligent that they were able to give them a fantastic education. And they all did extremely well in the exams. They were allowed to take the exams, not in the classroom with the others, but sitting in the corridors, which happens to my character, Bella. She has to sit in the corridors. So all the stories that I'm writing about, everything that happens to the characters, happened to the people that I met that told me their stories. Now, some of you might say, oh, but there was so much that happened in the north, and it was really terrible in the north of Italy. And the reason it was terrible in the north of Italy is that there is an area called the Tyrol, the Alto Adige. And this area was Austrian up until the First World War. It's part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the people that lived there were very, very Teutonic. They had more affinity with the Austrians and the Germans than they did with the Italians. And in that area, if you were Jewish living in that area, you struggled. It was really difficult. And even early on, they had to leave that area and flee to other parts of Italy. And I know people that had to leave and go to Tuscany because they were looked after so much better in Tuscany. So when I'm talking about the things that happened that were amazing acts of kindness, I'm talking about the amazing acts of kindness that happened in the areas that I researched. And I know that in the north, in the Alto Adige, it was very difficult. And again, I bring this into my book. I talk about the Bosen, who are the people from Bolzano, who consider themselves to be much more Austrian, much more Teutonic. And a very funny thing happened to me this week, actually, because somebody knocked at my door to read my smart meter, which never happened to me before. And she came in, she was a really lovely woman, and we were chatting. And she said to me, "Oh, where are you from?" And I said, "London." I said, "Where are you from?" And she said, "Italy." So I started talking to her in Italian. She said, "Oh, I don't speak Italian." And I went, "Ah, I know why you don't speak Italian." And I said, "Do you speak German?" She said, "Yes, that's my mother tongue." And I thought that was really interesting. And she came from the Alto Adige, which is this area that I just mentioned. And still today, these people see themselves very much as Austrian, Germanic, rather than Italian. And their food is very different. They eat canedla, which is really different from the Italians. Italians have pasta, they have canedla. And that was interesting seeing her. And I didn't mention the book because I don't speak too kindly of the people that came from that area, but perhaps I should have mentioned the book. And so this is Eleanor Servi. And just to tell you a tiny bit about Eleanor Servi, her family were hidden, and they were hidden by so many different families in Vitigliano. And these families used to go along and take food to them and take medicines. One of my friends in Pitigliano, his uncle was a doctor. I based my Dr. Mazzola on him, and he would go hunting and fishing, and he would come and say to his mother, "I'm going hunting, I'm going fishing," and he would come back with no catch and no fish. And she would say, "What is it?" And he would say, "Don't ask." So they kept their stories very quiet. And the reason they had to hide, it was because when Mussolini in 1943, when his government fell and Badoglio took over, Italy became part of the Allies. And the Germans then had to march up from the north and from the south, and they came through Pitigliano, and many of them lived in Pitigliano. That was the moment that they all had to hide. So up to 43, the Jews in this area were very safe, and they had to hide in 43 when the Germans arrived. And that was the bit that she told me a lot about. And my character, Angelo, as well as representing the Catholic side of the village and the benevolent, coexistent Catholic side towards the Jews, he also is very much based on a man called Fortunato Sono, who was responsible. He was a contadino who would go on his donkey, and he would trot on his donkey to find Eleanor Servi's family and bring them food. And he did that 2 to 3 times a week, and he did that for the whole duration of 6 months, which is why she was hidden for 6 months with her parents. And he did that, and he is actually mentioned in The Righteous Amongst Nations in Yad Vashem. And I did a talk for Yad Vashem a little while ago, and I mentioned Fortunato Sono because for me he was one of the most important people. He was illiterate, he was a farmer, but he just did something an incredible act of kindness at great risk to himself. And I just thought that was really quite special. So this was Eleanor, and this is Roberta. So I'm going to move on, going quite slowly. This is a Seder that we did in 2017. So the girls who work for the synagogue, none of them are Jewish, they work for the synagogue, and they're totally and utterly devoted to the synagogue. And they asked me if I would do a Seder because they were worried that Eleanor wouldn't have a chance to do another Seder. So in 2017, we did a Seder in what's called the Rabbi's house. It's not the original Rabbi's house, but it's a house they use for visiting rabbis, and it was free. And so we did this Seder there, and my husband and I went down to Rome, and we bought all the food and we brought it back. And the interesting thing was at the Seder, myself and my husband and my 2 children and Eleanor, and everybody else was not Jewish, but they were there because they felt that this was their history too. And I found that really, again, quite incredible. And one of the guys that's totally dedicated to the synagogue, people belong to the synagogue and they aren't Jewish, and they pay to belong to the synagogue, which I also find amazing. And I said to him, I said, well, why are you so interested? Are you Jewish? He said, I'm not, but I feel that I am because I feel it's my history too. So I used to get that everywhere I went. This is my history too. And that's, again, very, very special. So here we are. This is our Seder table. Now, these are the batons that I mentioned a little bit earlier that Count Medici used to make his soldiers go to the houses of the Jews and knock on the door. And the verb was sfratare, which means to evict. And these are called sfrati. And sfratto is an eviction. and they symbolize that eviction of the Jews into the ghetto. And they're made with pastry and with honey and orange peel and sometimes walnuts as well. And they are traditionally used for Rosh Hashanah by the Jewish community. They would always have them on Rosh Hashanah. And another interesting thing of the coexistence is that the Catholic community eat them on New Year. So they are sold in the shops and eaten and made by the Catholic community to celebrate their New Year. And they were also made to celebrate Rosh Hashanah. So another example of the coexistence that I discovered in this village. Just check how I'm doing for time. Right. Oh, goodness.
So we've got plenty of time, don't worry.
I seem to have lost my my Zoom here. Hang on. Have I lost the Zoom? My screen sharing. Why have I not got my screen sharing? 1 second. I seem to have lost the Zoom.
You're still sharing.
Yeah, I can't see it.
Oh, okay.
Hey, you're screen sharing. It's just gone from here, so I don't know where it's gone from here. Ah, there it is. Got it back. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so the next one. So these are the sfrati. So I did a talk for a synagogue in Cambridge early on in the year, and somebody was inviting me to do a talk for their synagogue. And when I talked about the sfrati, this woman decided she was going to get the recipe and make them. So she did, and these are the sfrati. So you can see how you make the pastry in these long kind of stick things, which resemble batons, and you fill it with the spicy mixture, the honey and the orange peel and walnuts. And there's a picture here of the batons with my book. Again, this is another symbol of the coexistence. Mourinho Bartuccini is also in his 90s, another amazing individual, not Jewish, but a partisan. And he very much inspired me for my character, Rico, who at the beginning of the book, we're not sure what his political tendencies are. We discover that he does become a partisan. And a lot of the research that I did came from him. I did masses of research on the partisans, on the Jewish partisans as well, and the Jewish anti-fascists. But he told me what it was like being a partisan in Pitigliano. And it was very interesting. And this was something I really wasn't aware of, that it was much easier for him, or much harder for him rather, being a partisan than it was for Elena Servi, who was a Jew living in a fascist state. She managed to have an easier life than he did up until the Nazis came in 1943. And that was very interesting to hear what it was like being a partisan. He was arrested. He ran away from Pitigliano, and his mother had a feeling that where he was hiding. She went to try and find him, take food to him, and the fascists of the village followed her and arrested him, and he was sent up to the north to a prison. He then escaped, and his story was very interesting, and it gave me the feel of what it must have been like for the partisans at this time. And very difficult for them also in 1943 when the Germans came up. Then they really suffered as well. This is the villa. So I talk about Villa Sofia in my book, and it actually was inspired by a true villa called Villa Emma, which took place in Nonantola, in Modena, in Emilia-Romagna, another state. And while I was researching my book, a friend of mine told me about this villa, and he said, this is an incredible story of where Jewish orphans were hidden in Italy during the fascist era. So I did my research and I decided to write a short story about it, which I did. And I read it to quite a few people, and they said, no, that story needs to be in your book. So I transferred the story to the book, which is one of the reasons I changed the name and made the village Monterini, because I included lots of other things that I discovered during my research of this era. And this is a really interesting story because, again, remember, we are in a fascist country. And the organization called Delassen, it's a Jewish organization during this time, it managed to bring over 72 orphans from mainly from the former Yugoslav Republic. There were a few German orphans, and there were a couple of Hungarians, and there were some Roma and communist children as well. And they were all at one stage in the former Yugoslav Republic, and they were brought over by a communist man. with the help of this organization, Des Salem. But the thing that was so interesting about it was that the foreign ministry closed their eyes. They knew that this was going on and they knew that they were being housed in this villa, but they closed their eyes. And the aim was to house them there and teach them the local dialect and pass them off as Catholic orphans, so that when the time came, they could get them out of Italy to Palestine and they could be part of setting up the new state. And they were taught things that would be really useful if they could get to Palestine. And so they were taught to be farmers and carpenters and all things to do with the land. And you can see some of them there. And so the story of the villa is completely, I've kept everything about the villa true. The way the children have discovered is true as well. I won't say too much in case some of you want to read the book, and I don't want to give too many spoilers, but everything about this was a true story. And the guy who owned the villa was an anti-fascist Jewish man who left. His name was Signor Romano. He left the villa very early on and gave it to the organization to use for whatever they could feel would be useful for them. So this was the story of the villa, and it is another fascinating story. And as I did my research, I just discovered more and more incredible things of what people did in this country to save their Jewish brethren. And there were stories of the priest in Assisi who'd never ever seen Jews before. When the Germans arrived, he realized he had to try and help them. So he hid them in the crypt of his church. The same thing here in this village, the partisan priest, he was a priest and he was partisan, and he hid the Jews in his cathedral. When they had to, these orphans, when they had to leave, when they're found out, he took them and hid them. And these stories just really resonated with me. I found them incredibly moving. And I just felt that there's so many things about the horrors that we hear, but we don't hear so much about the incredible stories of survival and protection that I did discover in this research. And I think that's really one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. The other was I really felt that I was in love with this village. And in a way, one of my friends said to me, it is like a love letter to Pitiliano. And I think that's what the book is. It is a love letter to the village and to the people in it who have really inspired me. And this is just a last picture. Before I finish, actually, I'm just going to add a couple of other things that while I was writing it, I was writing my book and nearly at the end, and then it was 2013, because this has been a long trajectory. It got published last year, but it's taken a long time. And in 2013, while I was writing, the story came up. It emerged of a story of a Nazi. I don't know if any of you will remember this story, but there was a Nazi called Erich Priebke who died in Italy. And his story is really interesting. So I started to look at this because it was a huge thing. They wanted to the Germans wanted to bring him back and give him a hero's funeral. And the Italians refused to let him go. And it was a huge, big thing at the time. And so I started to research and I discovered that he was quite an important man in SIPO, which is the police force. It was the Nazi police force in Italy when the Germans came up in 1943, and they were very important there and they had a lot of power. He was responsible for the police force in Rome. And his role was, he was involved in an absolutely terrible tragedy and catastrophe that I'd never heard of. And when I mentioned it to my Italian friends, they all knew about it. It was called the Fosse Ardeatine. Some of you who are historians may know about this tragedy. It's called the Fosse Ardeatine, the Ardeatine caves. And what this guy did is he took 335 people. They were men mainly, just anyone he could see, and he murdered them. And the reason he did this was because there had been a bomb the week before in Via Rasella by the partisans, and the bomb was for the people that I mentioned before, the Bosen from the Alto Adige, who loved the Germans, and they planted a bomb and they killed 35. And the Germans had this rule that if one Nazi, one German, one fascist is killed, we kill 10 of you. So he found 335. So he even did more than the 10. He found these these people, 72 of them were Jewish, and they're all men, young boys, some really young, and he took them to these caves and he murdered them. And it was a terrible, terrible murder. It's really well known in Rome, it's well known in Italy, but I'd never heard of it before, and a lot of people hadn't. So I started to research it, and what happened was he disappeared, this guy. He managed to get out of Italy, and he went to Argentina, and he was saved in Argentina, and he felt safe. And what happened was in the 1970s, a journalist went to see him and talked to him, and he bragged about his role in this terrible, terrible massacre. And so this journalist went back and told the Italian government, and they arrested him and brought him back to Italy. And he was in Italy under house arrest. And then when he died in 2013, there was this big hoo-ha. And so I started to research it, and I thought, this is an incredible, really dreadful massacre that needs to be mentioned. And so I brought this into my book, and I bring this guy and his boss, Kapla, also into my book, and I bring them to Monterini so that we can hear about this terrible tragedy that they later committed. So these were some of the stories and anecdotes that I discovered in my journey and in my research. And even things like when people would say to me, when the Jews had to leave the village, when the Germans were arriving, they would talk about how they would take their things and hide them. I heard about how the rabbi would hide the Torah, and the priest would come along and hide it for him. They would bury the Torah, and they would bury the prayer books. And all these stories I filter through and weave through my stories. It happens to my characters. So it's all kind of true stories within a novel. The situation of Bella and in having to convert, people converted in those days to remain safe. And I heard this all the time. And having written the book, I get stories and emails from Italians who say, you know, this was my mother's story. I didn't know about that my mother was Jewish until a couple of years ago. And I've had several people write to me to say, like, my parents were Jewish, and I never had any idea. They were forced to convert. They had to convert to be protected. And so all of these stories, again, I wrap around my novel. And so if you do read the novel, most of what I'm talking about is true, although the characters obviously were also invented. You can invent if you're writing a novel. It's not just non-fiction. So it is a combination of both. So I am actually coming to the end. This is my book in our streets. You can see, those of you who may have read the book, the setting is exactly as I describe it in the book. And last year, my son managed to get a little window to go off during the pandemic, to go off to Pitiliano. So he took my book for a few members that I'm friendly with there, who unfortunately don't speak any English, so probably can't read it, but I did give them the book. So that's the end of my journey here. And I'm really happy to take questions, any questions that you might have.
Well, I must, that was fantastic. And I'm sorry that you stopped. I thought you'd carry on for another hour.
Oh, really? Well, if you have questions, there might be things that will come up.
Well, I'm sure. Well, how realistic is the novel?
Well, as I've been saying, I mean, all the historical events, completely true. Everything that happens, all the events that occur.
It didn't sound like a novel.
It is, yeah, it is a novel.
Yeah.
It's, you know what, it's a mixture of history and fiction. And so I've invented through the history, I've used the history and the facts to invent. So the characters are invented, although inspired by certain people that I mentioned before, and I thread the stories around them. So, you know, you feel you're there because the place and the setting is there. Yeah. And the story about the villa is completely true. But, you know, I invent as well, because that's what novelists do. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. But when you first went to the is it a town or a village?
Well, it's a village. It's a big village. So you can
okay.
Go down if you like.
But what was the population total, and what was the sort of the Jewish population of it? Because when you said, you know, you walked into a shop and there's matzahs and there's food and there's wines, I was shocked. I mean, you don't expect that, do you? There.
No, and we were shocked. We were shocked. We couldn't believe it, and that's why, you know, why there? Why did we go there? I mean, it's not known. It's not known by anything Jewish. Anna, who recommended it, she comes from the north. Why there? And it felt like we were meant to be there in a way. And it felt to me like I was meant to write this novel. And that's when the story started to percolate in my mind. And yes, we were shocked when we saw all these things. And they were there. They're there for the Italian tourists. And the synagogue is a really, really popular tourist attraction, which is incredible. And the girls, when I was last there, which was 2 years ago before the pandemic, they were so excited to tell me that the synagogue and the museum had more visitors than anything else, I think, in Tuscany. They said it was even better than Florence. They were so excited. They had so many foreign and Italian, mainly Italian visitors. And they are the ones that buy all these specialities, the kosher wine and the matzahs and the sfratti as well.
I rarely watch food programs, but I watched, by chance, I was watching Jamie Oliver maybe 3-4 years ago, and he was in Bertigliano, and he met Eleanor, and he went to her home, and I think he cooked artichokes or something with her, and they spent whatever time it was peeling the artichokes and cooking. But it was, I must say, I was fascinated by what I saw, and went to the internet, which obviously you couldn't have done in '98 probably, but I went to the internet, saw the pictures, and literally fell in love with the place. It's halfway between Pisa and Rome, and it's stunning, absolutely stunning. And the fact that Eleanor at the time was obviously 3 or 4 years younger than now, but she was very much a character, and was that person who carried forward the Judaism of that town or village. And it was fascinating. So I could understand where you were with that, and and just to ask the question is, I can understand why you wrote the book, but delving into the history, how do you feel it differs to many, and I haven't read your book, so I don't know how involved it is with the Holocaust, or certainly with the Second World War, but how much of the book relates to the Second World War?
Well, it starts in 21 with the rise of Mussolini. It's about the rise of Mussolini rather than a Holocaust book. It's about a community in Italy and how this community survives. And it's about a Catholic Jewish bond within that community. And actually, more than anything, I suppose it is about acts of terrific kindness and generosity. And that's really what I wanted to show. And particularly in this village, everybody was saved. I expanded because I discovered things outside, and I had to make it a bit more of an authentic account about Italy, which is why the story is slightly different maybe than if I had just written a non-fiction account of Bertigliano. But I didn't want to write a non-fiction account. First of all, I feel that I want to write novels. I'm a novelist, but also I didn't feel I had the right to write a non-fiction account because the people in that village had done that in Italian, and it's their village. And I felt that it was okay for me to write a story that was partly invented based on truth, and I felt okay to do that, but I didn't feel I had the right to actually write non-fiction of their stories. That's why it was a novel. But it is, I mean, it does talk about all the events that occur, all the historical events, things that Mussolini does, is threaded right the way through the novel.
You said obviously that people in the town can't read English, so they couldn't read your book. When we were talking earlier, you mentioned that there's an audio book which is coming out in September, I think, something along those lines. Are you doing an audio book in Italian as well?
Well, the Italian, no, not yet. It would be lovely, but at the moment, it's up to the publishers to get the translation rights in different countries in Europe, and that's what they are trying to do. So I suppose if it is translated into Italian, then there'll be an audio edition as well in Italian. Hopefully, that would be lovely. That would be really lovely. Yeah.
I think the Goldsteins are anxious to talk to you.
I'm unmuting him if you'd like to. If you'd like to unmute
his hand up as well. Yeah.
Yes, that's why I'm doing that.
You're on, Charles.
Okay. We're unmuted.
Yeah.
Hi, Amanda.
Yes, I've just finished reading your book, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and it was lovely to hear the backgrounds again from you tonight.
Good. Did it put it into perspective a little bit, seeing the slides?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. It was lovely to see the slides.
Yeah.
Really.
And you said, Gail said that she would recommend to everybody who's listening to read the book as well. I had a couple of questions. I was just wondering, firstly, who are the people who go and buy this kosher wine and the matzah that you saw there? It seems, I mean, do they get many Jewish tourists there, or are local people?
Yeah, they do many more now because it's much more well known. We went in '98; it wasn't well known at all. The Italians, Jews knew of it, obviously, and there were some American Jews then at the time as well. And the American Jews actually helped to fund the refurbishment of the synagogue as well in the 1980s. It was from Canada, so they knew of it more than we did over here, I suppose. But now it is much more well known, and as I think it was David Landau said, this Jamie Oliver program has actually made Eleanor quite well known around the world, and now people in Australia, we've got a pandemic so they can't come, but they started to come and they knew about her a lot more, and she really is an incredible person. And I just wanted to say one thing about the program that you saw, David. She didn't know who Jamie Oliver was. She really didn't. She didn't know he was famous. She knew nothing about him. And when he came along with the other Italian cook that was there, she just turned to me. She said, "Oh, your student's not bad, is he?" And I just found that hysterical. And when I told her, I said to her, he is actually a really, really famous person in England. He's a really famous. She goes, "Oh, I didn't know." And she's just absolutely lovely. And she this year has received a commendatore, which is an honor of merit by the President of the Republic for all her services to that community and to the Jewish culture and history of Pitigliano. And that is something really special.
Great. Okay.
Okay.
Good. Okay. I'll follow Gail and read the book as well.
Are there any other questions?
Yes. Going back a little bit, you obviously love writing, but did you always want to be a writer, an author?
I think I did. I always liked writing, and I was writing short stories, but I didn't actually have a novel. It wasn't something I really knew what I wanted to write about. I knew I wanted to write a novel, but it was only really when I went there that the idea came to me very quickly. Just the characters popped out, and I saw them sitting there on their balcony, and that's when the idea germinated.
How long did it take you to write that one?
Long time, 10 years.
Oh, really?
Time, a lot of research. I was working, so I wasn't dedicating myself to writing. I was doing a lot of working, young children, and a lot of research and a lot of rewriting and a lot of discovery of new things, like as I said, the Eric Kripke situation in 2013. So it changed and evolved as I went. But it did take a long time. But it was finished quite a long time ago in 2016. I think it takes longer to be published and to get out there. I had an agent and then a publisher. So that's the kind of trajectory of that novel.
Are you planning on another one? Because obviously you're very excited about doing the first one.
I'm co-writing a novel, which I have also been doing for quite a long time with another friend of mine who is a writer, and that's set in Italy. It's not a Jewish theme. It's set in Italy in the 60s and 80s and in London, and it's quite a commercial book. And then the one I'm writing on my own, it has got a Jewish theme, and it's set in Odessa during the Odessa pogrom in 1905, and also in London in 2005. So it's got 100 years difference.
How long? How long will it take you? Well, not another 10 years, surely.
No, definitely not. I haven't got the time for another 10 years to write it.
Okay. Does Pitigliano mean anything?
No, it's just the name. It doesn't have a meaning. No, it's just the name. You know what I haven't mentioned, though? Actually, I haven't mentioned something that's important, that often when I do talks to book clubs or to people that have read the book, they always ask me the question about the Etruscan character. And I don't know if that was something that came to you, Gail, when you read the book. There is a character called Tanakila, which is an Etruscan character, and she is kind of like a spiritual character. And people either love this character or they dislike this character. And it's really interesting because often people ask me about it, and they ask me why I included this character. And just to let people know, if you're interested in reading the book, then you'll have an idea why she exists. The reason is the place, when we first found it, it's an incredibly magical place. David Landau said when he saw photos of it, when he saw the video, he could see it was really special. So how do you put magic when you want to write about a place? You have a magical realism character. So that's what I did. So she was like this spiritual figure, but there was more to it than that. And the bottom layer of Pitigliano is Etruscan. They're all Etruscan caves. Our house is partly Etruscan. So you have this incredible Etruscan layer. Then you have the Catholic layer, the medieval Catholic layer, and then you have the Jewish layer. So you've got these layers of civilization. And the Etruscan layer has completely disappeared. The Romans obliterated them entirely. We know very little about what their customs were, who they were as a people, and they were obliterated, yet their essence is really strong in this village. And I think what happened to me was I just thought, what happens when there are no Jews left here? And Eleanor is old. What happens in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years to the Jewish presence? And I think in a way, in order to kind of protect the Jewish presence, I think I felt like I needed to protect the Etruscan civilization and show that civilizations do come and go, but their essence really remains. And that's why I brought in this Etruscan figure. Okay. I hope that makes sense to any of you.
I hope so. We've got a question from John Winlow in the chat box, and he says, Amanda, I'm intrigued by the idea that Italian Catholics would have been responded so positively to their Jewish neighbours. As you know, the Catholic Church has been less than friendly with Jewish people.
Yeah, well, what the question is. Somebody here. Yes, well, the Vatican, but actually when you research and you actually see lots of stories, what the Catholic Church in Italy actually did, they did a lot of very good things. There were terrible things in the Vatican, and you read books all the time about what happened in the Vatican. But there are also priests within the Vatican who did actually bring children in and hide them. And you hear this all the time. And the partisan Catholic priests, I think it was more the partisan priests who were responsible for hiding these Jewish children. They were partisans and they were anti-fascists. And even though they were Catholic, they were anti-fascists. But the Catholic community of this town was very, very much entwined. People say all the time, we are like this. They come up to you and say, we are like this. And there is another example actually in 1799 of, it was during the Napoleonic Wars, that there was a movement called the Sanfadista movement, and they attacked the Jews in Pitigliano because they thought that they were being sympathizers towards Napoleon. And so the Catholics in the village came to protect the Jews, and together they fought against this movement and they won. And so as a result of that, every year they would have a harvest festival in the cathedral and then in the synagogue to remember this incredible event together, this community event together. And so in this village, this is how they were. I mean, you have to just accept it from me. This is how they were. And when I look all around at the examples that I discovered, there are so many examples. And even, I mean, I've got a list here of the numbers of Jews that were sent to the camps and died throughout Europe. I mean, you all know, Germany, Poland, it's horrific. But Italy, a fascist country, it's really small. There were 7,000 Jews, that's all, that were sent to camps. And a lot of them were partisans, they were anti-fascists. It was 13%, it was the third lowest number of Jews in Europe that were sent to camps and that died during this period, which is interesting. Again, I reiterate, it was a fascist country. And that to me is quite incredible that it was the third lowest number, because so many were protected. 30,000 lived in hiding during this time. They lived in hiding and they were hidden by their Catholic neighbors and by some of the Catholic priests as well. So we have to acknowledge that even though there were many, the Pope Pius XI was dreadful, and there were many Catholic priests, I'm sure, that were dreadful, but there are also many partisan priests that did their best to help. So I think it's really important to remember that.
It's interesting, but because actually the Jewish population of Italy as a whole is very small, really, isn't it?
Very small now. It was 58,000 before the war.
Is it before the war? So what, it's probably about 20 now, I think.
Well, after the war, it was they lost 7,000 during the war that were deported. Now I think it's much less. I mean, a lot of people have gone to Israel, you know, and moved to America and different places. But there is still a sizable population in Milan and Rome.
Yes, that's where most of them are.
20,000 now, actually, something like that.
Yeah.
And also there's marrying out, which is right among certain communities. But you mentioned what happens to the places where there are no more Jews, and that's why there are Jewish heritage charities around the world trying to protect, and as a reminder for people that there were shores, and to try and resurrect shores or even cemeteries where there are Jews before they fall to rack and ruin. So they should be retained, and so that it be remembered that Jews have been in these areas, and that it shouldn't be forgotten that they were all across Europe at one point.
Yes. I think the thing that's so unique about this particular place is that it's the people living there who aren't Jewish who want to retain the history and the culture as well. And that's quite unusual compared to other parts of Europe where there were Jewish customs, Jewish people. This is quite unusual because it's the Catholics, the Comune of Pitigliano gave a huge amount of money to for the refurbishment in 2002. So that again is really quite amazing. That's why for me it was such a unique story, such a different story, such a positive story actually to come out of the Holocaust.
There are places in Poland like that where there are no Jews left, where the non-Jewish people are very interested in bringing it back. It's interesting that where there are no Jews, the non-Jews are actually interested in retaining the memory of the Jews. Yet when there are Jews in places, they're not particularly liked by the non-Jews. So it's, I think the word is irony.
Yeah. But I think we've got another couple that, do you know them? I think they've written something in here. Do you know Jenny and Alan Goldman?
Jenny and Alan Goldman. Yes, I do.
They've said here, they're darked out, they don't like to show their faces. But anyway, and what they're saying is, what a fascinating talk, Amanda. We have been spellbound listening to and looking forward to read the book. Love to you and Julian. So I assume that they do know you.
Yes. Hello, and thank you. Thank you for being there.
There is another question. Are you, rather than are there any, are you aware or do you know of any other villages in Italy where there were Jewish people and with a similar history?
Well, I know there are lots of other towns and villages where I know Genoa and, you know, obviously the bigger cities, Florence, and Rome, obviously. In Pitigliano, there are 3 different villages, small villages, and 2 of them nearby did have Jewish communities, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, they did. And then what happened was they moved to Pitigliano later on because it was bigger and they merged. But you can still see a ghetto area in one of them in particular. There's a village in the north called Monte San Salvino, which is where I bring Jacobo's family from. There was a terrible massacre there in the 16th century and they had to leave. So these villages had lots of Jews earlier on, and so they probably still have remains of shuls. I know in Monte San Salvino, they're trying to resurrect the Jewish life there. And Elena quite ironically says, you know, she thinks it's just because they can see the success of Pitigliano as a huge tourist attraction. So they're trying to do it for that reason. But so there are pockets around the country, definitely. But I think the history is further back. It goes back a few years rather than during that fascist era. I think they'd already left by then.
Yeah. Stanley Russell wishes to ask a question. I've unmuted you already.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
What David was saying about undiscovered places where there were Jews rings a bell, because my father's parents were mixed marriage. My grandmother was Sephardi and my grandfather was Russian. And my wife and I, must be 25 years ago now, went to Barcelona on holiday. and a shawl and ritual bath had recently been excavated, and we visited this place, and I was absolutely overcome. I knew it. I'd been there before, and I was completely taken aback and absolutely overwhelmed. And I can only imagine that this was where my grandmother's family came from.
Mm. Was it where she came from, your grandmother's family?
There's nobody around to tell me now.
No.
And there wasn't then. All my grandparents passed away before I was born.
There is so much rich Jewish history around, and I suppose you could write a story about so many of these places. But I think, again, I reiterate, one of the reasons I did it was because it was just these acts of kindness that really touched me at this really dark time. And I wanted to show that these acts of kindness did take place in a country that was regarded as a fascist country.
Well, I have actually started writing about the family, because I'm a volunteer at a care home called Lady Sarah Cohen House, and we do a weekly newsletter that goes to all the volunteers. And I've sent in several articles. I started with being evacuated at the beginning of the war. I got on to schooling in a wild part of North Wales. I've covered conscription and moving from a mobile job to coming to settle in India. My son has had his life story published, and he said he'll introduce me to the publishers when I finish it.
Okay, we've got a question from Faye, and quite an interesting question. And she says, are there any other villages in Italy where there were Jewish people with a similar history?
I think we've answered that already, David. That's the last one on.
Yes, we
Was it?
answered.
Yes. Yeah.
I've
already read that one out. That was before Stanley came on.
We didn't mention her name.
No.
But in the chat, I just put the book. You can buy the book online from Amazon. A lot of people don't like Amazon, but you can get it from Waterstones or Amazon if you like, or Waterstones, or directly from the publishers. And I put the link of the publisher in the chat if anybody is interested.
Yeah, okay.
And
actually, I was thinking of just before, where the Jews were arrived obviously some time ago, but where did they originate from?
From the Iberian Peninsula. They were from the Iberian Peninsula that came there.
So they would be all Sephardi, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they were Sephardi. They all came from the Iberian Peninsula. The Jews that in Rome are quite different because they came over with the Romans from Israel. They are quite different. They have quite different beliefs and customs, actually. It's very interesting. But the ones in this area were mainly from the Iberian Peninsula, and they went to the Papal States. They were expelled from Spain and Portugal as well, and they came to the Papal States, and then were expelled from the Papal States, as I mentioned earlier on, and then came to this particular village where they were welcomed. And again, it was because of this community of farmers that didn't have any competition with them, and quite happy to have them settle down next to them, which was quite interesting.
Because when you say Italy and Italians, I've always felt that they're fascists, but they killed Mussolini, didn't they, in the end?
Well, they were a fascist country. Also, there were a lot of fascist Jews, actually. I often mention that. There were fascist Jews. There was loads of fascist Jews. There was one called, and I never remember his name, Ettore Evazza. And he set up a fascist newspaper called La Nostra Bandiera, which means our flag. And he set up, and he really believed in Mussolini, and he really believed that Jews would be fine. And he was a fascist. They had very nationalistic and fascist views. One of them was Jacopo Olivetti. You might know the company Olivetti. It used to be quite well known. So there were quite a few Jewish fascists. And this Ettore, who set up the first Jewish fascist newspaper, he really believed he'd be okay. And then in 43, when the Germans came, he thought there'd be no problem. I'm a fascist. There was a problem, and immediately he was sent to the camps and he died. So that was also quite interesting as well, that there were many Jews that believed in fascism, and many Jews that actually felt that Mussolini was good for them, and they did feel Mussolini was good for them. And then they discovered, as soon as the Germans came, that it wasn't okay. And again, I think that having had a Jewish mistress, Margherita Zarfati, as I mentioned earlier, did perhaps colour his attitude slightly towards the Jews. He definitely didn't treat them the same way as Hitler did. But if you were a Jewish and anti-fascist, you were in trouble. Okay. So I hope that clarifies it a little bit.
Absolutely, absolutely. Are there any other questions?
There's been some lovely comments on the chat, so thank you very much for.
Oh, you've been reading those.
Yes, I've had a quick look, and there are some lovely comments. Really nice to hear what people think of the talk. I'm really, really pleased that you found it entertaining and inspiring. And thank you very much for inviting me, David.
Hold on. I think we've just got another one from Charles.
Question.
A quick Charles on his own, I think. Charles, David.
No, hi. You know what I want to say, Amanda, was that just on the subject of Jewish history in Italy. I mean, we've been in Puglia quite a few times. Puglia had about 20% of the population used to be Jewish, and there's a huge amount of Jewish history in Puglia. There's many old shuls, and there's a Jewish museum in the south, and Jews had lived there, but also they were interned there after the Second World War, and they sailed from there to what was Palestine in those days. But there's a lot of Jewish history in a lot of Italy. Okay.
Yes.
Gail says. Yes, and on that point, Gail says good night. It's 11:15 here in Israel. So
thank you for joining so late as well. Really appreciate it.
Okay, I think any other questions?
No,
nothing going on. David, over to you.
So we've reached that hour. Amanda, thank you so much for being here this evening. A very interesting talk, especially the fact that I'd already fallen in love with Pitiliano, so you've enhanced that, and I will now go and read your book. It sounds very interesting, and I will do, and as I always tend to do, is do a bit more research behind everything else around the area. So who knows, my interest in Italy, which has always been there, may have just been re-enhanced. So I look forward to reading that. So thank you very much for being here this evening. It's very interesting. And thank you everybody else who's been here this evening to join us for Wednesday Night Live. Just an advance warning, Wednesday Night Live, we've been running since the 5th of July last year. This is our 55th event. And we actually will be finishing on the 25th of August. The whole month of September is out, and we will make a decision about how we return in October. The only Wednesday night which was available to us was actually Kol Nidre, and I'm not sure what we could say about that evening. So just to say that next week we have with us a slight change in tack. We have Tony Zendel with us. He will be speaking about Jews and film and a feast of trivia. Tony was born in Manchester, and he has a background as an educator and communicator, and is a trivia maven, collecting the arcane and obscure, especially if Jewish. So please join us. It should be very interesting. He will be sharing clips from films going way back, and I know that he probably doesn't know this, but uncredited in Duck Soup, which was a Marx Brothers film, there was an actor called David Landau. It was not me, and I'm just giving you prior warning on that. So that's my piece of trivia. But thank you again, Amanda, for being here with us this evening. Thank you, David, for hosting the evening. And over to you, David.
Okay, well, okay, we'll sort of carry on. If anybody wants to stay on, and we have a little mussel and chat and everything, and we have a l'chaim as well if you want to, with pleasure. John Winlow, you mentioned something. We don't know what we're going to do beyond September and Yom Tov, but if you ever, I know because you came in quite late. As David said, we had 55 odd interviews, but we have them all in YouTube. So if you want to hear any of them, just let me know, and I'll tell you how to get in there.
Yeah, what we may do come October time is we will be looking offshore. So because people in theory, and we hope will be back to being with each other, we will be looking to bring those people into ad hoc Wednesday night lives who are not based in the UK and can't necessarily get here for just an hour or so. So they will be from somewhere else in the world, and they will be of some interest to people, but they will be not as regular as we are having at the moment unless we hit the A-list. And we'll have to see what happens. We believe we've had the A-list up till now. So hopefully it all continues and we will see who joins us. But as I say, we're effectively ending on the 25th of August, and we will be back at some point in the future.
I'm going to leave now, but thank you very much again for inviting me, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, and good luck with the book.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay, good. And I'm worried, why is Flora being so quiet?
David, I'm going, so I'm going to pass you host.
What, you're leaving me with Flora?
I'm leaving you with everybody.
Okay. Okay. Can they demute?
Oh, hang on.
What?
Where are we?
Are we demuted?
I've just had to end the stream. I always forget to end the stream.